to start. Gino Smolin, you can dock me some strokes. But thank you everybody for being here. We really appreciate your support. It's a great day for the MGA to bring this community together, especially today at Bethpage, standing next to the Ryder Cup trophy. Pretty cool stuff. So hopefully, I think we have a great agenda for you this morning. I heard people talking about doing projects at their course and other things like that. So without further ado, I'd just like to get into the first presentation. You just silence your phones, make sure we're in good shape with that, and we'll go through the morning, have a break at about 10:15 hopefully. We'll try and stay on track best we can, and have a great panel discussion with some Ryder Cup officials coming up after that. For the superintendents in the room, we have certificates for you so that you can get your credits. So when you leave here at the end of the day, make sure you get that from the guys in the back of the room. But I touched on doing projects at the course. When we got the panel together to kind of put today's agenda together, that was something that came up that was important to the superintendents and the green chairman that polled for the survey to put the agenda together. And speaking to them, we talked about maybe doing something in the finance world. So we're happy to have Ken Butler from Club Benchmarking here with us this morning. Club Benchmarking has been working with a number of clubs throughout the metropolitan area and assisting them through the financial challenges, questions, and concerns that come up on projects such as this. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ken Butler from Club Benchmarking to start us off.
Good morning. Great to see everybody back here on Long Island. Just to expand on what Kevin just said there, we are currently working with 58 clubs within the MGA, about 15 of those here on Long Island, and then the rest between North Jersey and north of the city. So we're very, very happy and proud to be a partner with the MGA, and always appreciative to get in front of crowds such as this, and a lot of friends in the crowd too, I might add. So you probably know who we are. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through our background and what have you, get into the meat of the discussion. But we've been studying financial operations, capital, and membership data, membership satisfaction data now as of April 1st, it'll be 16 years since Ray Cronin started the company. And since then, we've become the #1 source for data-oriented benchmarking for clubs to use. We have the largest database of everything from financial operations and capital and member survey data. So we use that. Our researchers and our software engineers have been studying it constantly, and today I'm going to bring forward a strategic checklist, if you will, around how to get that capital planning into the DNA of the club so that there's alignment from the membership all the way up through and including the board and the senior staff. We think that's a really important thing. I know you've seen over the years a chart that looks like this, and I think last year it probably had 3 buckets. Now it has 4. We think since the pandemic, the industry has shifted a little bit. As an industry, we've kind of improved a little bit on financial health, although there are still clubs, about 25% of our industry that's in that red bucket that are still declining, and they have an existential issue from a financial standpoint, which has not changed. And those are the clubs that they have the 2 fewest members and need the most members, and they just don't have a compelling experience driving forward. And most of that is because the inability or lack thereof of capital investment over time. Whether it's big projects or just run rate capital in general, those clubs are very, very challenged at the moment. Some of that reason is their culture. The culture of the club is more of a customer culture as opposed to a steward's culture. We'll talk a little bit about how to transform that if there's an issue with that at your club. That's one of the issues that we'll talk about here. So we have the orange bucket now, which is new, right? And those are the clubs that are kind of flat or slightly growing in their net worth. These clubs may have been at one time been red bucket clubs. And so they are actually been communicating with their members and teaching their members the important aspects of the club business model and how it relates to them as individuals. And so those clubs now are emerging from the dregs, if you will, and their net worth has been growing slightly over time. They moved into the yellow bucket, and those clubs are starting to grow a little bit more moderately, a little bit of a better pace. And so you're seeing a transformation from a customer culture to an ownership culture across the industry. A lot of that can be seen in the wait list. You know, before the pandemic, 25% of clubs had a wait list. Today, it's well over 50%. So there's been a lot of growth in the club industry from people interested in joining clubs, and of course with that comes the expectations of the club experience, and a lot of that has to do with the physical facilities of the club and renovations ultimately. Of course, you got the green bucket clubs. These are the clubs that are succeeding. Right, and this is all sizes of clubs too. It's not just the largest clubs. It's not just the name brand clubs that you all know. These clubs have an ownership culture among the membership, and they're well educated on what's important at the club from a financial perspective and a CapEx investment aspect, and of course, and they're more willing or less likely to put up a fight when it comes to asking for the money that the club needs to perpetuate itself forward, and of course the membership experience. There's some things that we've learned over the time, and by reading and by actually being in clubs. We're in hundreds of clubs every year, and all of us that are in the field team, there's about 6 of us that are constantly traveling from club to club. We see the clubs personally, we understand their data, we see their benchmarking data, and a growing number of them, we actually know their membership satisfaction data as well. And of course, when we're there at clubs, we're able to connect the dots between what we see on the balance sheet and income statement and to what we're actually seeing at the club, and can oftentimes make judgments on, okay, their balance sheet, this explains why their balance sheet has a net to gross ratio that's less than 40%, let's say. We're not going to get into a lot of those metrics here today. We're going to talk a little bit more general, a little bit more strategic, if you will. But we've learned by being at clubs, looking at the data, and being in clubs and interacting with boards and management teams, that there are 2 primary things that clubs have to overcome. Number 1 is the never-ending churn of committees and board members. So the turnover in the leadership structure of the club from a volunteer standpoint is a strategic issue and needs some focus. You know, with 2 or 3 or more new board members every year, of course you have the churn at the committee level too. Without an overarching vision or plan, sometimes it's subject to the agendas of new people that come on, and that sometimes can be injurious to the club from a future financial perspective. And so things to overcome that would be, succession plans, but we would say having not zero-based, but bottoms-up data that informs the governance over time and maybe lives above and beyond every board. So there are processes and not just the culture of personality, if you will, because the culture of personality runs rampant in clubs. And having tools available to you that can help steer the club consistently over time and continuously over time, and staying away from the episodic approaches that many clubs find themselves in, especially when it comes down to major capital projects. The second thing is an inherent conflict in clubs, and that's the members are the owners of the club, and they get to set their own prices more or less. All right, so human nature would state that they're not going to set their prices too high. But what often happens is there's a propensity to put downward pressure on prices like initiation fees, dues, capital dues, even some of the usage fees of the club, like in the dining room and what have you. And so what happens then is there's usually some pressure coming upward to the board from the members about the club being too expensive, possibly. I don't think any of you have ever heard that. And what happens is if the board starts paying a lot of attention to that and then starts governing from that perspective, in essence what happens is the members actually become the governors of the club. And the board starts managing the club from that perspective as opposed to leading from the perspective of growing and preserving the club's assets. And so it runs the risk of the members actually becoming the governors and the boards becoming the managers. And then what happens in some of those cases that managers end up being somewhat micromanaged, and what happens there is the good manager ends up leaving the club. And that's one of the ingredients as to why we have kind of a higher than normal senior leadership chairs at the club from a professional perspective. But the key one here is the letter C under there. Are the current members contributing to the required capital to meet the future needs of the club? And that's both obligatory and aspirational. And so how do we know that? Is it something that we're doing on an episodic basis? In other words, is it reactive, or is it something that we're doing continuously or proactive? And what we've learned in the industry is that it's been over time really an episodic or a reactive issue across the industry for years. And it's beginning to change, and we're going to talk about how that's changing. So when you put large projects that often come up, especially golf course projects, and we'll talk a little bit about that, we believe that project planning is subordinate to capital planning. And so in the effort to get it into a more continuous and more robust planning and strategic position over time, because we've also learned that members appreciate a more incremental approach as opposed to big chunks approaches to it, and probably is more healthy aspect to look at that. Plus it's hard to do, right? It's a very messy process. So when you define a fiduciary, we ask the question, I'll leave this rhetorical for now, but as fiduciaries of the club, are you responsible to the entity, or in other words, the club, or are you responsible to the members, right? And that's the question. I think that a finer point on that is, we're actually fiduciaries to the entity before we are to the members, and because of that culture of conflict of the members being also the owners and the only customers, and also they get to set their own prices. So we believe that the proper standpoint when talking about capital is that we're in the business of protecting, preserving, and growing the assets. Now that's no different than any other industry, right? I mean, it's what we do. And for this case, we're trying to generate capital income that flows into member equity. In other words, the return on equity is through capital income from members, and then the return on experience is how that money is invested. Mostly that's invested in the net book value of property, plant, and equipment. In other words, the things that you use, the toys, the amenities, the fun. So I have about 5 items on a checklist here, and I'm going to go through them one by one. And some of the information you see is familiar. You've seen some of it before. Some of it might be a little bit new, or maybe you haven't seen it in the same context as we're presenting it here today. Either way, we're trying to be helpful and trying to bring forward what we've learned by working with hundreds of clubs in capital planning to this point, and how that has helped clubs. So, number one, and we believe that in any kind of a strategy from a club perspective, that it's more effective if it is a bottom-up strategy. In other words, you're collecting data that for the people at the top of the organization to consider when making important decisions. And the first of these is quantifying the club's aspirational and obligatory needs. And of course, both of those are highly quantifiable. First and foremost, from an obligatory standpoint, is having an asset evaluation that is essentially an asset inventory, useful life, and replacement cost analysis. Very important. At the median club with about $30 million in gross assets, that's going to be about a 500 line item report. And making sure that that's in a format that can be updated regularly, is updated as frequently as a month each month, and then having a mechanism by which you can also update the replacement costs in the out years, because what we've learned since the pandemic that there's something called inflation, and there's something called the ability to get something when you need it, and so having that evaluation in an updatable format that you can count on for being accurate can be a tool that's going to help you avoid the costly mistakes that can happen. There are mistakes that can happen and just from omission, or just because I didn't see that coming, those kind of things. And so the asset evaluation is very important. And of course then connecting that to a funding tool or a funding strategy ability so that you can actually talk and socialize around assumptions that are going to essentially fund a program looking forward for 10 years. Looking forward is very important. You have a big project coming on. Consider, You go back 10, 15 years ago, we were talking about a project on a golf course that was going to cost $5 or $6 million. That was a big project. However, we're seeing projects now that are, what, 25, 40, even $50 million nationwide, depending on the scope of the project. But the $5 to $6 million almost like routine capital these days. Whereas, and you can Google, in the public domain, the projects of this nature, and they're in there, that 30, 35, 40 million. How's that get funded? Well, with a forward-looking funding plan, you can at least get that on the map and start incrementally working on that through the strategies modeling process. We think that's an important piece. We also believe that a transformation towards a best practice. We believe that once you have your obligatory needs quantified, then it's a best practice then to match those needs to your recurring capital dues so that it's continuous over time. Recurring capital dues is the most reliable form of capital income that's going to flow to member equity and then be invested ultimately in property and plant. That's not going to be possible right away at many clubs, but there's a club that I worked with just recently where they had done a major project just coming out of the pandemic, a $14 million project actually. It was between the golf course and the clubhouse. But when they got to the other side of that, it was a huge project and helped them a great deal. But they learned through analysis that they weren't going to have enough capital to maintain that for the next 10 to 20 years. And so we embarked on a process with them. And much of this presentation is really based on that experience and the experience of other clubs. But the bottom line is that they weren't going to have a capital dues that was going to be reliable enough to match their obligatory needs over time. And in this case, we used an 8-year ramp up to get to that. Okay, and they could do that. They had a runway for that. Some clubs just don't have that runway. But in this case, they did. So we used an 8-year process to get their capital dues to an equilibrium with their obligatory needs. That will enable them going forward to utilize their initiation fees for the aspirational needs of the club. So when you're talking about big projects potentially, there's usually an aspirational component, but most likely there's a big obligatory component to it, especially when you talk about golf course renovations. So there's things that you already own that need to be renovated, then there's things you want to add. So there's always a combination of obligatory and capital. We'll talk about that in a second when we talk about member education. So we believe this is a best practice in the structure or a philosophy, if you will, on financial philosophy towards capital. So matching that capital dues obligatory, which will also, by the way, include principal and interest on debt, we believe. Because we believe that it's a proactive approach. If you're using debt or assessments, that those actually be directed towards aspirational needs, because then your newer members are also paying for that, and as well as your current members. So let's talk about how the assets of the club. And we looked at 166 clubs with golf where we had done a recent asset evaluation over the last 6 to 7 months. And we learned, and I circled these 3 bars here on it, that's your golf course. And we've learned that there's short-term capital, there's medium-term capital, and there's long-term capital, right? So the short-term capital is going to be equipment and things of that nature. The medium-term is going to be some of the golf course elements and the irrigation, and then the long-term is going to be buildings and structures and what have you. But as you can see, in the makeup of these 166 clubs, the assets that are on the golf course made up 50% of the total asset package of the club. So if you're a $30 million gross asset club, let's say, suppose, 15 million of the gross assets are most likely on the golf course. And that's greens, tees, fairways, irrigation components, that's earthen berms, that's pond liners, pump systems, drainage systems in some case, and other things. So you can see where a proactive approach to managing assets has a lot to do with the golf course, and take that forward. Then from a funding perspective, that bar all the way over to the right, 61% of all future capital costs are going to be directed towards the golf course. And the thing about golf course renovations, they happen in bulk, right? They don't really happen evenly over time. you're gonna renovate greens and bunker complexes maybe once every 20 years. But that's gonna be a big outlay every 20 years possibly, or 15, or whatever your policy is, or whatever the useful life ends up being. Irrigation systems, probably 15 to 20, although there's a lot of clubs that will see their irrigation systems go out way past 30 years in some cases. But anyway, it just goes to show you that the greatest number of your assets are going to be in your golf course, and the greatest cost for replacement are going to end up on the golf course as well. And so when we talk about major projects against capital, it's important to have forward-looking capital planning so that you're always looking at those potential projects, because anything that happens on the golf course ends up being a big project. Checklist item number 2. And this is really important. We can't overemphasize this, because this is oftentimes the game changer in clubs. Boards and committees and senior teams tend to do a pretty good job of getting aligned around their approach to finance, especially as it relates to capital. And sometimes it's episodic, sometimes it's continuous, but the more continuous it can be and the more forward-looking it can be, the better. But if you want to really get into on the path to success where your members also understand that, can't be overemphasized. So investing in the time to ensure that your members understand. It is a very difficult process and a very messy process at times, because it's not just a town hall, right? The club that I just mentioned, we spent the better part of 2 weeks spread over a 2-month period of time so that we could get in front of as many members as we possibly could, to go over the bottoms-up data, and then to go over the strategies that the leadership team had been working on to get their input and what have you. Okay, and so that time spent is arduous, it's hard to do. I think a lot of times board members, especially presidents and others, end up being the whipping people, if you will, for certain members of the club that pound on. But more members that understand the business model of the club, the more likely you're going to find alignment among the membership, so that you get more of an ownership mentality going as opposed to the customer mentality. So some of those things are things that we've talked about before. These are the 5 critical business concepts that we think every member should understand. And number 1 is operational, and that's that the club is a high fixed cost business and that costs are good, because those expenses really apply to the membership experience. And if you're constantly trying to draw back on those or cut that, you're potentially injuring the member experience possibly. Number 2 is understanding the key drivers of success. I'm going to talk about a few of these things. We're really focused on capital and capital projects in this. And then understanding that the club's net worth is important, that it needs to grow over time, because in order for that net worth to grow, that means your capital income has to increase every year. All right, so if you're breaking even on the operations, then the only place you're going to find that growth of net worth is going to be in your capital income. That's initiation fees, capital dues primarily, and maybe assessments if you use those. And so as you invest in the club, your depreciation number is going to go up. And so depreciation pulls net worth down, and CapEx and capital generation moves net worth up. So if your depreciation is growing smoothly every year, so then most of your capital income grows smoothly. And that's these are the 5. And then one of the key things is that the clubs that are succeeding are really competing on the value that they offer. They're not competing on the price that they charge, even though there probably is, in a highly competitive environment, some version of that. But even the clubs that are succeeding in those high concentrated markets are probably the clubs that are charging the most and have the most members. This chart, just to remind you, is just to say, the financial driver of the club is the capital income. You'll see here, and this is all clubs with golf across North America, mostly in the United States, but the blue line there is the operating result of the club. The median club is flat, 0, break even. And then on either side of that, plus or minus 4% of operations. So it's not the financial driver. And if I were to look at this from an MGA perspective, the chart would look exactly the same. Okay, your median in the MGA is 0, break even. and it's the same metrics left and right of that, so I didn't change it. The real financial driver is that capital line, which is the gold line above it, and the median is 20%. 20% of capital income to operating revenue. 20% or higher is probably the clubs that are approaching that green bucket. So generating that capital for the members is the challenge, and getting members to understand this is not that hard to do. We've learned that members appreciate objective data, and they don't appreciate decisions that are based on opinions. And sometimes members don't understand the difference between data and opinions. But at least when you can, if you're building a data-driven presentation to talk to the members about the business model and why it's important for them to contribute capital over time, and why it's also important to provide the necessary funds to the operation, because that's where we pay for the fund, then the more they get aligned on what's needed from them in order for the club to succeed forward. I showed this slide because this is the net available capital ratio in clubs looking back to 2010. And just pointing out one thing, you can ignore the COVID bump there, which is that hump that you see there around 2020 and 2021. That was the government money that was supposed to go towards payroll, but actually ended up in the capital coffers of most clubs. But you'll see since 2017 and looking forward to 2024, there's a general upward turn, and that's capital income, and you're seeing it growing at anywhere from 4, 5 to 6% at each. The median, which is the red, and the 25th percentile, which is the yellow, and the 75th percentile, which is the green bucket clubs. The point of the matter is the club industry has been growing its capital generation, albeit very slow, but it is a positive movement in the industry. And when members see this, they say, okay, it's not just us. We're not unique. We have the same business model as a club in Topeka, Kansas, even though we're here in Long Island. And it's true. The fundamental financial model of clubs is very, very consistent from place to place. What makes you unique is where you are and the members that you have and your traditions and all that. But your financial model, we find, is not that unique. We get our money from the same place and we spend it in the same ways. And we have the same needs from a capital perspective. For that matter, clubs are capital intensive businesses. And when we look at that, we see at the median that the capital intensity ratio is around 283%. It's a little bit higher than that in the MGA. In fact, the MGA's median is more like 310%. So what that means is that that's $3.10 of capital to produce $1 of annual operating revenue. So it's a capital intense, one of the most capital intense industries actually of all the industries that we've studied. And so it starts to ring true to members when they hear this information and say, okay, that's why our initiation fee is going up. That's why our capital income, our capital due is now $150 a month when 3 years ago it was $25 a month, let's say. There are examples like that. There are still examples where there is no capital dues in clubs. Okay, so moving on. Checklist item number 3 is collect and understand membership satisfaction data. This is really important. In order for members to become aligned with a vision, they really have to feel that they've had a voice in the whole thing. Whether it's a survey or focus groups, whatever vehicle you're using, we suggest surveys because it's highly quantifiable. And then tell the members what you learned and what actions you're going to take and how it's going to affect their pocketbooks ultimately. So when we look at satisfaction data, and we do hundreds of these a year, we have thousands of individual member responses available to us to benchmark and then tie it back to the financial data. There's one thing that I'll point out, because we're not talking about F&B so much, but F&B is always the lowest rated amenity at the club. And yet it's always singled out as the most important amenity from a satisfaction standpoint. And food and beverage has an oversized impact on overall club satisfaction, club member satisfaction. So let's look at it from the golf course perspective. Number 4 there, golf is universally the amenity with the highest satisfaction. Okay, and that's important to note. I'm going to bring up a point that I think is sometimes overlooked when we talk about this. And you'll see this chart here is the pecking order of satisfaction scores from amenity to amenity. And you'll see the golf course maintenance satisfaction rating is 6.2, not 6.2 out of 7, by the way. All right, and this is across the industry. So when we see this club to club, it's very often times where we'll see, scores at 6.5 or just below that, upwards to 7 out of a 7-point scale. So why is that important? Well, if you have a 6.5 rating in your satisfaction on golf course, that means half of your members rated it at a full 7 and half of them rated it at a 6. All right? And so then that's every club. So there's a competitive aspect to it as well. So the continuous application of capital into the golf course is kind of important if you're going to maintain that satisfaction level. And so we find that there are clubs that have lower than 6.2, and those are the clubs that have ignored their capital spending on the golf course, and that means they haven't done anything major for quite a while. From a strategic standpoint, how do we keep our satisfaction rate on the golf course at that 6.5 or higher, knowing that members are going to be very willing to score it high, but knowing too that all of your neighboring clubs are scoring the same way, and in a competitive environment, maintaining that is quite expensive. Number 4, be transparent with the membership. Take them under the hood, okay? Let them see the data. You're going to have financial and operations data, and you're going to be able to benchmark that to your local clubs, your regional clubs, your golf association clubs, and even nationally. Okay? You're also going to be able to benchmark their satisfaction scores and let them know what they said, what their fellow members are saying about this. Okay? And then taking them under the hood and letting them know that everything that around costs really has more to do with their physical footprint and their expectations on the level of quality at the club than it does their location or the other clubs around. We, as an industry, have a habit of maybe put together the spreadsheet where we have here's the dues at this club, here's the dues at this club, and then on forward, and you kind of make a value. Well, that's where we are. We're about the middle of the pack, so that's about where we belong. Notwithstanding the idea that the footprint, your footprint, is what drives the operating cost and the capital cost. Certainly not necessarily what other people are charging. And that's a little counterintuitive maybe, but we've learned this by studying it and running regression analysis that it's actually true. And that the clubs that are significantly underfunded to their footprint tend to be clubs that are struggling. And then those also then tend to be the clubs that are trying to focus on the operating ledger to maybe make some money, and that really isn't happening anywhere in the industry except at very few places. So that mission clarity becomes really important when talking to members and opening up the idea that you're going to be very transparent with them, not only about the business model, but their responsibility in providing the funds ultimately to the club. So that first one there has to do with the operating statement, and that's maintaining a membership experience that's compelling. It's compelling enough that you have enough members, they're having fun, they're having a great time, and they're spending enough money to provide that for the club. But the second verse there is probably the most important as far as today's discussion is concerned, and that's continuously having enough capital to overcome your obligatory needs and your aspirational needs over time. Because that's where the club stays relevant, that's where the return on the membership experience comes from CapEx investment, and the return on equity comes from money flowing into the member equity line from member money. Members understand the power of compounding, okay? And it's interesting because, we say that most members of the clubs over the course of their lives have been able to benefit from the power of compounding in their own lives, all right, in their own investments and what they do on a daily life and for their own net worth. But we've learned that over time, clubs, especially in the red, orange, and yellow buckets, those clubs over time, and in some cases the green bucket clubs, those clubs have been deprived of the benefits of the compounding over time due to trying to keep things maybe lower than they should be from a cost standpoint, okay? And so we've learned that winning and losing happens on the margins at clubs, and that the clubs that are most successful when they're coming to a decision are leaning into the membership experience and maybe adding expenses to the experience in order to make the experience better, which adds to dues and fees. And then the red bucket clubs, when faced with a decision, tend to be the cost cutters. They're the ones that say, well, let's reduce our operating hours, let's make our starting times at 8-minute intervals instead of 12-minute intervals so that we can get more guest play, or whatever the case may be. But those are kind of the thought processes between the two. The interesting thing about this from a capital perspective is we've learned that over time, member money over time, let's say over 20 years, about 85% historically has flowed through the operating ledger, and about 15% of all money over time has flowed through the capital. Okay, so a strategic consideration looking forward might be, say, if we are in that 85-15 history at our club, and it can be studied, you can figure that out, we can help you with it. But what if we're looking forward, it's not going to be 85-15, we're going to do 80-20, all right? We're going to spend 80% of all money over time going into the operating ledger, because that's important for the fund, but we're going to ask for enough money from the members to get to 20% of all money over time flowing through capital. So if you're a club with 500 members, and you apply that consistently over the next 20 years, that 20% ends up being about $12 million that you can expend into the gross assets of the club. Additional capital. In this case, it's going to convert to additional gross assets. That's an example of how the power of compounding can help a club, and that, historically speaking, most clubs have been deprived of that ability. There's the footprint concept, which I'm not going to go back into, but I'll go right to the checklist number 5. Yes, sir.
When you're computing the revenue of the club, do you include the restaurant revenue, or you're pretty much focused on dues and other expenses?
Yeah, the chart that you just saw in the operating result, that includes all operating revenues of the club. So food and beverage, operating dues, all the golf revenues that would flow through that, like greens fees and cart fees and things. So that's all operating revenues. Yes. So checklist item number 5 here. Articulate a description of the future state of the club. Probably an easier way to say that is develop a vision for the club that you look at over the next 5 years and actually describe that to members, because members gave you information and support to help drive that through either a survey, and of course you have your bottoms-up data on the capital side. But the critical questions are, what is your future vision, and how are you articulating that at a club? Are the members aligned with it? Is that vision, was it crafted by using the membership data? Hopefully it was, and of course it's informed by your capital needs and all that. So addressing things like generational diversity, that's a big issue these days. What will our membership look like? What will our finances be? And so there's at least 7 pillars to consider when building that vision. Here we're showing 8. Everything from membership to finance to management and staff governance, programming, facilities and campus, viability and communications and technology. So it's not necessarily a simple process to develop that, but we find that it's vital in order to get that program that you have that's an overarching habits of thought that the next board's going to take and run with, and the board after that's going to run with it, so that it's not just the now thing. It's actually something we're committed to as a membership. And just to look at this, I'm breaking down what we call net available capital. Net available capital is the combination of your operating ledger, your operating result, and your capital income. And you'll see over on the right the operating margin. This is across the industry. That yellow line is the median of the industry, as you can see. Historically, it's been right around break even, 1 or 2% better than break even. And then you got that COVID bump, and then it returned to course back to 1%, 2% at the median. So again, it's not the financial driver. If there is some money coming out of that, fine, but it's not strategic. All right, it's more experiential. The capital income is the chart on the left, and you can see since 2017, the amount of money flowing through the industry has grown dramatically. Okay, there's a lot of reasons for that. One reason is clubs have become popular. We go back before the pandemic. A lot of us were wondering and worrying where our next member is going to come from. Then the pandemic comes, and all of a sudden we have people all over the place, and now there's a general a continued interest in joining clubs, and many of us have wait lists now, and have had them for some time. We think that's more of a demographic thing than it is a pandemic. Pandemic helped, but we do believe, looking at birth rates across the United States, that there's going to be a tailwind for clubs for the next 12 years or so, and it's really based on one thing: the number of 42-year-olds that are coming of age between now and 2020 and 2033 is growing. It's never growing. We had the same pattern back when the baby boomers were coming of age. It's almost identical in terms of its slope and numbers. And so that bodes well. And the reason why that's important, the average age of a new member has been 42 years old. And it's been that way for decades, and it's that way today. And so with a growing number of 42-year-olds coming in strategically, it's easy to see where we're going to have kind of a tailwind or interest in joining. The question is, what is your club doing to be relevant to that as they become clubbable, let's say? And so part of being transparent with the membership is getting under the hood with what it means to them. What's in it for me? What's it going to cost me? What I get out of it? These 25 clubs here, and the names of the clubs are redacted on the left, and I don't expect you to be able to see this, but this is 25 clubs where we've done extensive capital planning work and have done the capital strategies modeling on it. The takeaway here is that all of these clubs have capital income over time, but through the process and all of these plans and most of these clubs have been ratified by the membership of these clubs. And in each one of these cases, the median of this case, in other words, the number 12 club, the median one right at the center, is generating an additional $1.8 million per year out of the program here. And in all of these clubs, they had a greater than 70% approval rate by the members because they went through the bottoms-up process, a very difficult to do socialization of the process, and ultimately then a presentation of the choices, and then ask the members exactly what they wanted to get out of that, which strategy suited them the best. And almost every one of these were incremental strategies, with very few of them being massive assessments. We talked about member money over time. I made those points already, the 80-20 idea. This is a look at capital planning, where we think the current patchwork is more episodic. And so what that means is that there's a project afoot. You design the project, you talk about it in committee and at the board, of course among the senior staff, and then you start getting the cost together on it. And this can sometimes take 5 or 6 years to get to the point to where you're talking to the membership about it. And that's a very messy, hard process. It might involve some attrition and all that, and finally there's a decision made. And then you do the project, it goes very well, everyone's loving the project. In fact, when it's all done, the people that were saying they were going to quit the club are now saying, hey, this is great, I'm glad I was for that. And why didn't we do this 10 years ago? That kind of thing. Meanwhile, and then what happens is, and that's done, and thank God that's done. We can take a break now, and then they kind of go dormant for a while in their capital planning until the next thing that comes up. And so what that happens, that's an episodic approach, it's reactive. We believe that because of the cost of things nowadays, that especially when you look at it from a golf course perspective, that it is absolutely imperative to look at it out and plan the finances of that. With that, what you know, is socialize it and get the members involved and make it more of a continuous process. We believe that's the best practice. And it's the time that it takes to invest in that to get the members on board is more than worth it. And then the cost of doing that, you can actually save money over time because you're actually looking forward instead of looking back. And you can plan what that's going to be and be much more efficient in your capital expenditures. This chart just talks about what I said before, and that is that member money over time, capital money, flows into member equity on the right-hand side. That's your return on equity. And then the return on experience is how that money is invested, and most of it is going to end up on the asset side as net book value of property, plant, equipment. So 74% on average is on your asset list is going to be made up of property, plant, and equipment. and 15% roughly in cash. So 90% of your assets in 2 lines. So that's why that member money over time, that flowing into member equity is so important. And once members understand that, sure, there's going to be people that kick and scream the whole way and don't going to get on board, but they're usually a smaller percentage. And if you can get 70% of your membership saying yes about a plan, you're going to win every time. And it's never a 100% game, right? So summing things up, and then we'll move on to the next thing, but it's we believe it's a process of collecting bottom-up data, both capital, finance, operations, communicating that to the membership, making sure they understand the critical business concepts of the club. Very messy, very hard to do, but very worthwhile. Okay? And then having a process by which we're looking forward constantly, and that capital planning is ultimately going to drive your big projects as well as your small run rate projects as well. And so with that, I'll just ask if there's any other questions, and then we can move on into the presentation. So hopefully that did a good job of setting up the rest of the program from a project perspective. Yes, sir.
One question, just difficult to forecast. So in your business, what are you seeing as trends down the line? What are you seeing flows looking at in the coming years? Lighting, driving ranges, or gyms and fitness facilities? What are the trends you see coming?
Okay, so we can see, we know what's been popular and what's been effective at clubs. We know that there's billions of dollars being spent on golf course projects in the last few years and looking forward with a lot of them on the books. And that's interesting because it's a lot more expensive now than it once was. The projects that have really helped clubs with membership satisfaction and building waiting lists have been more the non-golf sports area. And if it was golf related, it would be golf entertainment, golf practice, lighted ranges, using things like TrackMan on the range and maybe even top tracer technology so you can do some gaming as well. Have been very actually reasonable outlays to do, but impactful as well. Fitness centers are at the top of the list. Outdoor dining, of course, is very big. We know that food and beverage has a outsized impact on overall satisfaction, so focus on that is important. But as you saw by the chart, that the future assets around food and beverage is minuscule compared to what it is around golf. But there's a lot of capital investment happening right now, and with a lot in the non-golf sports, but we would have to say that the focus on golf course projects has increased dramatically in the last couple of years and looking forward. Yes, sir.
You just mentioned 70% approval of doing things. Is that, if you're taking a vote, if you had less than 70%, you wouldn't do it? Or 70%?
No, not at all. I think what we're saying there is that when we've been involved in these projects, and whether there's a vote or not, sometimes they don't need a vote, right? Some clubs need a vote. But in both cases, you want to know what the acceptance rate would be. And so if a club that doesn't need a vote, for instance, will use surveys coming out of a town hall or out of a focus group to gauge, one, their understanding of the information, and two, their agreement on the approach, especially if it relates to more money coming in from their pockets. And typically, if we've done a good job at delivering the education, we see a better than 70% approval rate. That doesn't mean 70% or nothing, it's a decision point. If it's 51-49, you probably have something to talk about or adjust. But if it's 60% or more, you probably have a no-brainer. In front.
Do you see any major discrepancies from public to private courses and what the goals are as far as capital?
You know what? We study pretty much the 501c7 private clubs. I would have to defer to somebody else on the public side. We don't put that data side by side. No. Sir?
Hey, Ken, I'm just wondering, you mentioned something earlier about the average age being 42. Where's that coming from?
Well, it comes from club data. When we ask clubs where their new members are coming from, what their age are, the average age right now is 42, and it's been that way for about 30 years. Doesn't mean it's going to be that way at every single club. It really has to do with the area demographics too. Like there are areas like where I'm from in Delaware that are naturally occurring retirement communities. So the average age of those clubs down there joining is like 60, you know, similar to gated communities.
So it's just the average age who's joining right now?
Yes, absolutely. Okay?